I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you are listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. So I've been thinking lately about how we digest criticism. I guess personal criticism, but really I'm thinking sort of about cultural criticism, literary criticism, political criticism. It has often been said and accurately said that it is easier to tear down than to build up. The truly impressive achievement is composing something positive in the literal sense that it stands forth out of the abyss rather than simply destroying something that already exists. It is much harder to build something than to tear something down. However, it is also much harder to rebuild something that has been torn down than it is to tear down the person who tore it down. So this came to mind in part because I listened to an interview. There was maybe a year or two ago, I complained to Cameron, might have been on a Secret Show episode, about this, at the time, semi-obscure alt-right philosopher, thinker, whatever, Curtis Yarvin, because I thought that his ideas were very bad and dangerous, but also that he was a very effective salesman for them, and a salesman for an attitude or a perspective or a movement in general. This is the guy who, among other things, repurposed the term red pill to refer to the contemporary political landscape. So he is, in addition to being a politics guy, he's also a poetry guy. He takes his poetry pretty seriously. Alice has already done an episode of Poetry Says in which she also attempts to take his poetry seriously and reads through some of his poems and talks about them. They are very bad, and she does a very good job of addressing that. I'm not going to do that here today. The reason he came to mind recently was because he entered what I think, let me put it this way. He became recently somebody that my dad might actually know about independent of my complaining about him. And that happened because he got interviewed by every responsible liberal boomer's favorite podcast, The Daily. He was interviewed by Michael Barbaro, who I personally find sort of insufferable. However, Barbaro did a very good job he and his team did a very good job of preparing, researching for the interview, and he was very hard on Yarvin. Yarvin talks to too many soft audiences who are all too ready to roll over for him, and so Barbaro was a very hostile interviewer, and I think did a good job of basically producing a hostile interview. He didn't really let Yarvin get too far along in any of his spiels, and he had a lot of active attacks on all of Yarvin's claims and on all of Yarvin's positive claims. So Yarvin is a monarchist, and Barbaro which is exactly what it sounds like, and is all of the criticisms one would imagine do apply. But Barbaro basically tore down Yarvin's own shtick and his proposal for a monarchy in America. And that's fine and good, but I think it sort of missed the point. And what I mean is that he made Yarvin look somewhat ridiculous, specifically to a New York Times audience. And he made a, reasonable case against his proposals for America, which are bad. And in some cases, his stuff gets very bad the farther you go into it at times. Sometimes I'll talk in a moment about some of the pussyfooting around hard racism stuff, but like weird eugenics and even bordering on ethnic cleansing kind of ideas. The point, though, is that Barbaro tore down all of Yarvin's ideas for what America should be like. What he didn't tear down, what he didn't even really address, was Yarvin's criticisms of America as it is now. Now, I'm not really interested in getting into that either. I'm actually going to talk more about poetry in a minute. I promise this is a poetry podcast, and I am going to get back to the poetry. But it seemed to me that there is this problem we have sometimes when someone who criticizes us or criticizes something we care about comes out with a kind of a compelling, or at least an infectious or annoying or dangerous seeming case against something we care about. Our response tends to be to try to poke holes, to try to find problems with the critic, and to try to attack anything that the critic himself might put out or propose. Well, what have you ever made? Or what would you have in its place? Or what would you, this idea you've suggested is ridiculous. And that's effective enough in partisan politics, but what it's not very good at is identifying the times when an annoying critic might occasionally make a decent point in his negative case. Right? And I'm not really interested in Yarvin's negative case against America, though I think that if you really want to disarm him as a political operative, you need to take on his criticisms of America as it stands, because that's what people find compelling about him. Like, when people get really into him, it is because they hear him say, this shit is fucked up in this particular way, and they say, yes, I have felt the same thing, and you've said it better than I could. Whether they're right or not, that is what they're responding to. And so if all you do is you tear down his positive case for monarchism, then you're not really addressing what people find appealing about him. Beyond the case of Yarvin, though, I read a book over the hiatus, I'll talk a little more about that in a moment, that made a positive case that I found totally preposterous. And yet the negative case it made, its criticisms of the status quo, I thought had teeth. And I think this is a really hard thing to do. When some shithead, when some asshole says something annoying about us, and it's very easy to point out why this person is wrong, why this person is bad, why this person makes lots of mistakes, why this person shouldn't be taken seriously. It's very hard for us then to say, and yet that thing he said about me might have some validity to it. And maybe I should try to respond to that. It's really hard to do. Right? I've said over and over in this podcast that there are a lot of really great thinkers who were far better at description than prescription. Freud, Nietzsche, Marx, among many others. I have even gone so far as to say that I try to avoid prescription at all, in almost all cases. Obviously not totally possible, and probably not totally wise to avoid it in all cases. I think it's a problem that people often make with Marx, right? They say, well, his proposals, and particularly the proposals of people who took him up on his proposals, are dubious at best in many cases. And so then they neglect to recognize that his criticisms of the status quo have a lot to recommend them. I was tempted to do like Alice and to make fun of some of Yarvin's poetry. I even found the most popular, he has two Substacks. One's a alt-right political Substack, and one is a poetry Substack. Because again, he's one of those people who was it fucking drove me crazy. Jimmy Carter died. Not Jimmy Carter doesn't drive me crazy, but Jimmy Carter died. The New York Times obit, the first word, not even in the obit, in the headline, poet. Jimmy Carter, poet, comma, statesman, comma, whatever. Poet. That is what Yarvin wants for himself. He wants, he has more humility in his in his assessment of his own poetry than he does in his assessment of his own political thinking, but like he loves it in a serious way. I don't think he is good, and I don't think he's even very well informed. What I was really tempted to do after I kind of gave up the idea of making fun of his poetry was the most popular post on his poetry Substack is a post in which he praises the finalists that he selected for the inaugural Passage Prize. This is I don't think it's like an explicitly right-wing prize / press, but it's, a sort of a anti-woke or, anti-whatever. Like, it's a lot of people involved with it are alt-right personalities with anonymous online handles, if that gives you any idea. So I was really tempted to tear into his descriptions of why he loved these poems so much. One of them I thought had a little something to it. Most of them I thought were very bad. And what he said he loved about them only made me cringe all the more. He doesn't seem to. He likes using some of the words for form in poetry, but he doesn't really seem to know what they mean. He used the word flow as a noun in place of the word meter, or modulation, maybe, depending on how you were to understand him. So I was going to make fun of that. But then I thought, well, I would be doing the same thing Michael Barbaro did, right? I would just be finding something about him I could tear down rather than trying to identify if there was any criticism he made of the status quo that might have some teeth to it. So I'll get to that in a minute. Very quickly, just because I am such a lover of weird slang, there was a little piece of alt-right slang that he dropped in his essay in his post about choosing the finalists for this prize. He said that one of the, by far, the worst form of Passage Prize submission was the nascent genre that Lomez, I think another alt-right anonymous guy, by far the worst form of Passage Prize submission was the nascent genre that Lomez and I nicknamed the Wignat nursery rhyme. Wignat is the weird little right-wing slang. I had to look it up. I thought maybe it was a typo for like wingnut, but it is not. It is a sort of portmanteau of two abbreviated words. One is a slur for a white person who behaves like a stereotypical black person, and the other one is nationalist, right? So it is a term for. This is a term. Well, part of what I love about this is what one of the reasons I love slang, because it reveals thinking, it reveals perspective. Sometimes it reveals the zeitgeist. But this is a term that wouldn't even make sense to use unless you were in this world and you had this particular perspective. Because what it reminds, so basically, what it means, Wignat is somebody who is a déclassé, crass, sort of lumpen white nationalist, like somebody who is crude and obvious and maybe a little bit too flashy or a little bit too, certainly not circumspect enough, but also maybe somebody who represents the brand badly in character and in style, right? This is what it reminds me of is like I knew a lot of genteel racists back in Atlanta, and to a man, they looked down on the Klan. Nobody despises the Klan more than genteel racists. And it's not just because the Klan is bad and violent. It's because it makes them look bad. And so this is what it reminded me of, right? Like, you would only bother to have this term if you did advocate the perspective nationalists, white nationalists, however you want to, describe yourself. But you didn't like the people who did it in a crude way that made you look bad or that gave away the game too much. People who actually, got swastika tattoos, this sort of shit. Prison racists, right? Like you're representing the brand badly. So that was just this little sort of morsel of weird racist slang that I thought I was just glad to learn it. I'm always glad to learn a new piece of weird slang. But then I said, well, all right, rather than just criticizing something he praised, I thought I would find if there was any good criticism he had written of contemporary poetry. And I did find, I think it was an abortive series, but he wrote a whole post about a poem that was featured on Poetry Daily. And he's very disparaging of this poem, but what I found sort of interesting about his treatment of it was that it was fairly subtle. That is, he kind of makes a point of not just of saying, hey, this is clumsy or this is stupid or this is bad. I mean, he says that about a few moments, but what he says is, okay, here's what it's trying to do. Here is the effect it is aiming for, and here's how it almost achieves it. And this was, I thought, maybe the moment that it made me cringe with recognition the most. When it was, he's responding to the very end of the poem. The poem ends, and then he says, he's quoting it in sections. So he quotes the end of the poem, and then he says, I think I speak for all when I say, all the best poems these days end with a question. The poem ended with a question. All the best poems these days end with a question. It is a sort of participatory, democratic invocation, like asking the reader to sing along. Eliding the question mark leaves a particularly delicate, pregnant pause, like the hush of a falling cherry blossom. This, I thought, was sort of devastating, and part of what makes it devastating is that he doesn't drive home the death blow. Really, all he does is say, yeah, I see what you're going for. I see that you think it achieves this particular effect. I see that that's what you are aiming for, and I see, and you got close enough that it was recognizable. He doesn't bother saying, it sure didn't have that effect on me. But that is pretty heavily implied. And what it reminded me of was I'm going to talk about a few things that have come up since I've been away. But one that I really loved was an episode of Poetry Says that Alice put out called The American Ecstatic. Definitely go listen. She basically just spends the whole episode trying to define and give examples of and discuss the various qualities of a subgenre that she is identifying in American poetry, this particular kind of American poem. I think she does a really good job of identifying, like, all right, here's this thing that keeps happening in American poetry. It is this. This is what it looks like. These are the elements it has. Here's the necessary and sufficient factors. And here is maybe how it looks to me. She doesn't say, don't do this. She just says, here's what it is. It's all description and very little prescription. It is among other things, a sort of a poem that is religious in nature. And there's a little bit of discussion about this on the Substack chat. SLEERICKETS.substack.com. Go sign up today. There's some discussion of it on the Substack chat because there are a lot of listeners who are themselves religious. Alice is not. I'm not. Australia is not. America is, as a rule. And the American Ecstatic is. But it's not she's not talking about all religious poems in America. She's talking about a particular style. And I would say not even a not even necessarily poems in which I would say that I might, you should listen to her episode. But something that occurred to me was that, because, in a conversation I had with her on the show before she put out this episode, I made a comment about how there is no room in America where it wouldn't be possible for somebody to call for prayer. There's no room in which there would not be an overwhelming pressure for everybody to bow his head. And the scoffing that you might initially have at this idea, I think probably comes from imagining only a room in which a white evangelical man is calling for a prayer, man or woman is calling for prayer. Of course, if you change some of those factors, if you imagine it being somebody of a different race, if you imagine it being somebody of a different religion, particularly if you are in liberal circles today and somebody and a Muslim person calls for a prayer, or a black Christian person calls for a prayer, there's going to be enormous pressure to bow your head, to at least play along. And if there's like one funny little wrinkle to the American ecstatic that occurred to me after listening to the episode, it was that I think there is a phenomenon in which poets know of this mode of speech, and it's a mode of speech that derives from religious speech. A preacher speaking excitedly, somebody giving testimony, somebody particularly in the black rhetorical tradition, catching a wind, right? Catching a sort of a rhetorical wind, feeling the Spirit move him, or speaking as if the Spirit is moving him. We're familiar with this mode of speech, and it's a mode of speech that, for all of these reasons, commands authority in America. We respond to that mode in America, not necessarily all by believing in it, but we respond by knowing that we have to play along. And I think there is actually, I don't know how conscious it is, but I think there is actually a phenomenon in which American poets, knowing about this mode, will basically they will play at that mode. They will fall into that mode. They will stir themselves into that mode of speech, not because they are moved by the Spirit, and not because they expect anybody else to be moved by the Spirit, but because they know everybody will have to play along. And that's what I thought maybe one could take from Yarvin's, again, like a sort of subtle criticism of this poem. I think I speak for us all when I say, all the best poems these days end with a question. It is a sort of participatory, democratic invocation, like asking the reader to sing along. Eliding the question mark leaves a particularly delicate, pregnant pause, like the hush of a falling cherry blossom. I did specifically, like a couple days before reading this, I wrote to a poet who was sending me some poems, and I said, in general, I am often sort of skeptical of poems that end with a question. He sent me a poem that ended with a question. I said, it's not that you can't do that, it's just that I'm often skeptical of that. It often, I think, fails in its effect. So you could take that. You could say simply that he's saying don't end poems with questions. Certainly don't end poems with questions that are not marked as questions, not punctuated as questions. But I think maybe beyond that, there is a little bit of just a reminder that we have a tendency in the poetry world to count on a certain kind of playing along. And I think it's just good to remind ourselves that, we don't really just want people to play along. Because this is what he means when I speak for, I think I speak for all when I say, right? That's the sound that you get at the poetry readings. At the end of the poem. At the end of the poem. And some of those are sighs from people who are genuinely moved. A lot of those are sighs from people who know they are supposed to play along. And it is when you are in a culture in which people reliably play along, with a certain kind of sentiment, it gets easy to rely on it. And it's just, I think, maybe what we can take from this guy, about whom there is much legitimate criticism to make. Like, there's a lot you can say about Curtis Yarvin being a piece of shit, right? And thinking shitty ideas. But it doesn't mean he does not have a point here. And maybe that's kind of the lesson I was trying to remind myself of. Like, okay, we should really, like, it's just good to kind of give ourselves a reality check. When we get excited, when, as my physics teacher used to say, we get happy about something we're working on, it is maybe good to remind ourselves that, like, okay, do I really believe that this poem can and will have an emotional effect on the reader, or do I just on some level expect the reader to play along? So that's what I choose to take from Curtis Yarvin as a critic of contemporary poetry. I leave it to all of the political thinkers to take on the rest of what he has to say. So I'm not going to fight that particular battle. But it's not enough just to tear down his ideas. It is you have to respond to the sharpest and most uncomfortable criticisms he makes of the status quo, of the liberal world order, of all of the ideas that, if you cherish an idea that he attacks, it's not enough just to attack him, right? You have to address his attack. As I said, I read a book that hit me sort of like a ton of bricks. It was a book that I agreed with 55% of it, roughly. I think Elijah would agree with 95% of it, roughly. It's called What is Art by Leo Tolstoy. And it is a bananas book. I don't think I'm going to have time to get into it all tonight. That may end up being the Secret Show episode. Maybe it will be next week's episode, and I will do some other stuff on the Secret Show. There's a lot of little stuff I want to get to, and a lot of catching up. And first of all, before I do anything else, a big thank you. A big thank you to Alice. I went on hiatus for 7 weeks, I think. I was only able to plan it with her. I mean, she helped me even get it to come about. She basically proposed that she just take a bunch of raw tape I have, and then she edit it and produce it and put it into episodes and write all the show notes and just give it back to me as a package ready to post online. She then did that with a slew of other episodes, most of which she concocted on her own. She completely ran the show, as you know if you've been listening, and ran it as a way tighter ship than I would have. In fact, any irregularity in the posting schedule was just because the minimal amount of work required for me to take what she had given me and actually put it online occasionally was work I slightly procrastinated in doing. So that was really the only reason there was even the slightest irregularity to the posting schedule. She gave me all of those episodes way ahead of time. There is still one more that she gave me that is it's a conversation I had with Brian. For some personal reasons, we're just slightly delaying the release of that one, but it will be coming out maybe in the month of February. I'll just have to check with Brian to see, but that'll be coming out soon. Conversation we had, and then she just, in her marvelous way, edited, introduced, packaged, and turned into episodes. So that'll be coming soon. I, in retrospect, probably would. I took a hiatus. If you didn't already know, I took a hiatus in order to be able to concentrate on revising a novel that I finished a draft of a little while ago, and I've been trying to kind of get it into some sort of readable shape. In retrospect, I might not have, if I had a do-over, I might not have planned my hiatus to coincide with the entirety of Christmas break, as well as a family trip to Disney World and Universal Studios. But even so, I didn't get through the entire novel, but I got a whole lot done. Well over half the novel, a couple hundred pages of pretty solid revision done, and I think I'm on pace to have a readable version by AWP if and when I'm able to get any agent to show any sort of interest in reading it. So thank you to Alice. Just invaluable. I mean, just truly the best. And as I said in the AMA, if you really want to know what she can do as an editor, you do need to listen to Poetry Says. You could do worse than starting with The American Ecstatic. Just terrific episode. And we Americans are self-absorbed. If you have ever been hesitant to listen to her podcast because you're worried it's going to have too much Australia in it, this one's all about us, guys. So just go check it out. I also wanted to single out for special attention a poem she published recently. I'm rusty. It took me a second to remember all the settings to do on GarageBand. I'm really rusty at this. I'm clearly also rusty at timing out an episode because this is going to be a very sort of odd, lopsided episode. But she published 2 poems recently with New Verse Review, and I thought they were terrific. And one in particular, I was just bowled over by. So I thought I'd read it because it's fairly short and I think quite good and moving. It's called Bad Boys for Life, which is, of course, the name of a 2000. When was it? There was this series in the late 90s and early noughts, Bad Boys, starring Martin Lawrence and Will Smith. Yeah, and then some 15 odd years later, there was a revival of the series called Bad Boys for Life in 2020. I think there was yet another one after that, but the guys were much older, and I have not seen any of these. I've never seen any of these movies. I've heard at least some of them are good, but I think it's a well-chosen title for a couple of reasons. Not least of which is the very very light and slightly tongue-in-cheek tone that it strikes. So this is Bad Boys for Life from the New Verse Review by Alice Allen, our very own Matilda. None of us escaped the snap to grid. Money's nag, its organizing force, the itch for real estate, another kid, a compromise that might delay divorce, more hazy resolutions to do better, all stale and obvious as what we did. House party handjob, weed with someone's brother, car park tequila, every nervous first diminished by the mild suburban smother. Naive, thin-skinned, I felt your careless worst, ignored it for your best, and glamorized the way you losers lost and loved each other. Nostalgia builds a shrine from the debris of everything that's wrecked and pissed away, attended by some tragic devotee, convinced there's something more she needs to say. My sweet bad boys, your faces looked like home. Ordinary, precious, part of me. Yeah, I think that's quite good. The title, it evokes both the period when this is all happening in the late 90s and early noughts, presumably, as well as the slightly embarrassing latter-day nostalgia for it, right? That's sort of embodied by the existence of the belated sequel, or I think it's the third or fourth in the series. But of course, also she's talking about bad boys, in the slightly goofy way that people do, right? The sort of the bad behavior or slightly physical or moral threats posed by like ultimately fairly trivial misbehavior in a very contained and secure setting. It feels to me like the texture is different. It is not quite exactly like, I'm trying to think like whose voice it reminds me of, and it doesn't quite, I think I hear a few different contemporary poets in it, but I don't know that any of them is quite like this. I was going to say there's a little bit of a kind of a spiritual nod to the poem I know Josh Megan is sick of us mentioning on this podcast, Cold Turkey, just because I know that's a poem that Alice particularly loves, and there's a line in it, "Our girls, good girls, have shaken off their trances." And I cannot imagine that line was not in Alice's head when she wrote, "My sweet bad boys, your faces looked like home." But I just think this is a really taut little poem that part of what I think is so lovely about it is that it possesses the Australian control of tone, which is truly like that's what they as a nation have just absolutely mastered. It's what they have a perfect nose for. They've cultivated in their poetry scene a perfect nose for tone. They do not admit of sentimentality. And part of what's lovely about this is that it has all of that self-mockery, all of that embrace of kind of unromantic modern quotidian language and jargon in defiance of ordinary emotion. And yet, maybe I think it's like partly with a little bit of our American influence on Alice is that she allows herself just slightly more sentimentality than I think. She allows herself slightly more honest sentiment, I should say, than I often encounter in the Australian poems I read. Not that I am anything like an authority on Australian poetry, but it is a kind of a lovely hybrid poem of these two nationalities. And most of all, it's just a poem that sounds like Alice. I'll read it one more time, just for anybody who had a little bit of trouble following, not because the poem's hard to follow, but because poems heard aloud once are hard to follow, especially for me. The first line, "None of us escaped the snap to grid." Snap to grid is a function of certain computer layout programs. There's an invisible grid, and when you move an object, it locks into place in one of several available locations. And it's just a very fleet way to evoke the experience a lot of us have in our lives of sort of snapping to grid despite ourselves, as if there's an invisible structure in which there's only a certain a number of available slots. So the poem begins, the first stanza is sort of the present day, dull middle age. What's the Terrence Winch line? The present is the life insurance premium automatically deducted from your paycheck while the past burns out of control in a vacant lot on the outskirts of town. That's what I was thinking of. But that's so the first stanza is the life insurance premium stanza, right? The present day, and it ends with all stale and obvious as what we did, right? And then there's a dash, and the second stanza is what we did, and it's the catalog of adolescent humiliation and triumph and misbehavior, and it's because of all of that apology, she sort of allows herself to let it swoon a little bit. And then she ends with one of these, it's like, it reminds me of that moment in Reference Back when Larkin says, truly though our element is time, we are not suited to the long perspectives open at each instant of our lives. They link us to our losses worse. They show us what we had as it once was, blindingly undiminished, just as though by acting differently we could have kept it so. Which was a stanza I talked about in a previous episode, but it's this sort of, it's a stepping back and making an abstract statement about experience in a way that's just so, it is really hard to do that well. It is really easy to do it badly. And that's how she ends the poem. And I think she pulls it off Nostalgia builds a shrine from the debris of everything that's wrecked and pissed away, attended by some tragic devotee, convinced there's something more she needs to say. I don't know if Australia, those lines might be against the law in Australia, but boy, she did them nicely in America. I'll read it one more time. Bad Boys for Life by Alice. None of us escaped the Snap 2 grid. Money's nag, its organizing force, the itch for real estate, another kid, a compromise that might delay divorce, more hazy resolutions to do better, all stale and obvious as what we did. House party handjob, weed with someone's brother, car park tequila, every nervous first diminished by the mild suburban smother. Naive, thin-skinned, I felt your careless worst, ignored it for your best, and glamorized the way you losers lost and loved each other. Nostalgia builds a shrine from the debris of everything that's wrecked and pissed away, attended by some tragic devotee, convinced there's something more she needs to say. My sweet bad boys, your faces looked like home. Ordinary, precious, part of me. Yeah, as evidenced by the poems Alice takes on in The American Ecstatic, we could really stand to learn some of the lessons of Australian heckling. Like, the Australians really, really do not tolerate. They're famous for tall poppy syndrome. They don't tolerate people putting on airs, but they also don't tolerate, at least in their poetry, naked sentimentality. It's one of the reasons I think that so much of their lingo is so goofy and even like babyish sounding. It's almost like they are like Orwell said that in 1984 the what was so diabolical about Newspeak was that it was engineered such that it was impossible to think a revolutionary thought, and I feel like Australian slang is engineered so that it's impossible to say a cringy or embarrassing sentence without deviating from the national lexicon. Yeah, anyway, go check that out. Go check out the other poem, Stakes, also I think very good. And I will do, there's a few things that came out. Oh, the Tar River Poetry site is live. So Tar River Poetry is a poetry magazine based in North Carolina. So a little bit of inside scoop. Alice and I are on the advisory board, for one thing, which doesn't really mean we give them advice. Really, basically what it means is like we write some prose for them sometimes. And maybe, I don't know what else. But I have mentioned a number of times in the podcast, there are two ladies I regularly do little poetry writing sessions with. I have, as my daughters at this point know, I am really, really bad at actually following up and doing those. I missed another fucking session tonight. I'm very sorry, Helena and Charmaine. But Helena and Charmaine, the ladies I've been doing this with for a few years now, are the co-editors of Tar River Poetry. So they are the ones who actually choose the poems. I mention this because Tar River Poetry is accepting poems. Send them poems. Their taste is not my taste. It's not Alice's taste. Both Helena and Charmaine write in free verse, but I think at least because of me, they have become, I won't say it just because of me, but like maybe partly because of me, they've become a little bit more tolerant of formal poetry. And I think they just want stuff that's interesting. They are, I think, really good compliments. I think they complement each other really well. I've talked a little bit with Helena about it. My hope is to get them on to talk some about magazine editing and other things. But in the meantime, go check out tarriverpoetry.com. They were very proud of getting the website up and looking decent. It was not a good website for a very long time, and now it is a pretty good poetry magazine website. Go there, check it out, read the magazine, and submit poems. Alice has an essay coming out, I think, in the forthcoming issue, which is coming soon, I think. I'm not sure when it's coming exactly, but she's got an essay coming out there. I'm really eager to read it. I haven't read it yet. So go check out Tar River Poetry. Also, there is going to be a new issue of Literary Matters coming soon. Literary Matters, I have not talked about this on the show yet. I'm going to talk about it at some more length. Probably not today, but Cameron and I have been at Literary Matters for a while. We are still there under the new editor, John Matthew Steinhoffel, who goes by Matt. I've been really impressed by Matt. He's got very big shoes to fill in Ryan, who wasn't just the editor-in-chief, but also basically built Literary Matters from scratch. He's not really a replacement for Ryan. He's running the magazine in his own way. And I think, as I said, I'm very impressed. Ryan is a genius. He's brilliant and unbelievably hardworking and productive. And so much of that magazine, he personally line edited. I mean, he was just so involved. He took on a colossal amount of work to do it. One thing I will say for Matt is that, unlike Ryan, he is very organized and very willing to delegate. Totally different style. I mean, I love Ryan, always love Ryan. But it's a totally different style working with Matt, and I think it's going to be a good issue. It is going to be a much, much smaller magazine than it was. None of us think we can replace Ryan. None of us think we can replicate what Ryan was doing. It's going to be something different. I think it will be good. Cameron and I are working there. More on that later. One other quick thing I just learned about, but it's so relevant to this podcast, I had to mention it. On Substack, there is a guy I'd never heard of. His name is Nick Prassas, Prassas, I think is it. But I'll put a link in the show notes. I already mentioned it on the Substack chat. So he is doing the thing. He is personally transcribing Geoffrey Hill's Oxford Professor of Poetry lectures. So the lecture series, Cameron and I and Elijah and Alice and plenty of other people have praised to the heavens for almost the whole length of this podcast. He is listening to all. There is no print version of it. I think I have heard from a listener that theoretically there is a print edition that will eventually appear. But in the meantime, this guy is transcribing all of them by hand. He just posted the first one. So I'll put a link to that. I mean, just what a fucking public service. So thank you, Nick Process. I think that's his name. I think I'll end with a poem. So before I get to that, I have a lovely student in the class I'm teaching right now. I'm teaching a fiction class. It was going to be a poetry class, but a little snafu. So I'm teaching a fiction class. This is in person in the Triangle. And I have a lovely, lovely student who's really interested in poetry. She's also very, very new to poetry. And she's had some great questions for me. We've had a little bit of correspondence about it. It's been just fun to talk to somebody who's brand new to poetry, but very smart. So she's already a accomplished professional, but is just new to poetry and interested in it. And so it's been just a lot of fun to talk to her and to try to sort of, I am certainly not talking to a child. I'm talking to a very, very smart and as I said, accomplished adult, but also somebody who aside from an enthusiasm for it is really, really kind of in the wilderness when it comes to poetry. So she had a question for me I was stumped by. The question is this: what's a good anthology for a total novice to poetry? I put this on the Substack chat already. I got some good answers from Ethan and Coleman. Ethan recommended David Kern's 30 Poems to Memorize Before You Die. David Kern of loving the sappy but not irredeemable Irish romance that I talked about. He's also the guy who does the Daily Poem, I think, and Close Readings, some literary podcasts. So he did a book called 30 Poems to Memorize Before You Die that also has some essays. Coleman recommended John Lithgow's anthology of poems. Apparently Lithgow also recorded an audio book that's very good. But I think both guys, I think it was Coleman who said, but both of the guys sort of suggested that it would be good in an introductory anthology, not merely to have raw, naked poems, but also to have some sort of accompanying text on them. Not necessarily a serious scholarly essays, but, some words about the poems might be useful for somebody who's new to the art form. The initial email Sydney sent was asking about a particular anthology she was considering buying. And it was, I forget the title, but it was sort of a generic, the poetry anthology title. I just remember that it had the word treasury in the title. And something about the word treasury makes me cringe slightly. And partly what it called to mind was a certain type of poetry anthology, a kind of a general poetry anthology, often called a treasury, in which the poems are just crammed onto the page, just one after another, after another, after another. Like they're just trying to save trees by cramming as many poems per page as they can. And it just sucks so much to read that kind of anthology, particularly when it's 800 pages and there's something just disheartening and unpleasant about the whole thing. So I was trying to find her some anthologies that were sort of not unpleasant to handle, look at, deal with, confront. I thought Ethan and Coleman had some good recommendations. I really didn't. So I told her, I gave her their recommendations, and I told her I would put it to all of you. So if you have good introductory poetry anthology recommendations for Sydney, let me know and I will pass them along. Thank you in advance. All right, so two last things. One, a little self-promotion. I had a poem come out in Ploughshares recently called Melancholia. I think somebody might have posted a snapshot of it online somewhere, but I was pretty happy with it, and it's there. It exists. So check it out if you have any interest. It's called Melancholia. It's in Ploughshares. It is, if nothing else, not very long. I also have a piece of prose up on the 32 Poems website. You can read for free. And I think Ploughshares, you either have to buy a copy or you have to find whoever posted the snapshot of it, or just ask me and I'll send it to you. But there's an essay up on the 32 Poems website called Where the Money Is. And it's responding to a poem by Nita Sofa Saroon. She wrote a poem called Violent Femmes in the recent issue of 32 Poems. And David does a thing. I think it's a great feature where he invites the contributors to an issue to respond to one of the other poems that appears. So if you have a poem in an issue, then you're sort of invited to write a little essay about any of the other poems that are in that issue. And it's a kind of an interesting series. I've done it once before, and they vary a lot in length. Like some of them are just 500 words long. Some of them are a few thousand words. I think mine is 1,500 maybe-ish. But I was really taken with this poem. It is a poem that maybe has a little bit of a kinship to Alice's. I think it's quite good. I'm not going to explain what I like about it here because I wrote a whole fucking essay about it. It is also, though, the essay, I should say, is sort of an essay. It takes this poem as its occasion, and it talks plenty about it. But the essay is really an attempt, in part, to articulate what I mean when I say that I read like a pirate. That when I read, I am reading with the goal of theft in mind, of stealing new things that can make my own poems better. And it's sort of an essay in which I tried to talk through that process of how exactly it is that I tend to read a poem when I read a poem, and especially when I read a poem that I like. So that's up there. I'll put links to all of these things. I spoke to Nita, or I corresponded a little bit with Nita, who is, I think she has a new book out with LSU, which is, it's a new series that LSU is doing. That Wyatt Prunty and Leanne Couch are editing together. I think this is Nita's book is just one of a few in that series that have just come out. So go check that out. Check out her poem on the 32 Poems website, and I'll just read it here. Part of what I liked about it is I grew up in Atlanta, and I think Nita and I are roughly the same age. So that was what sort of caught my attention initially. But I just think it's a very quiet and lovely poem. It's not exactly it's sort of a nostalgic poem, but it's not exactly pure nostalgia. Like Alice's, it's a little bit of an apple with a razor blade buried in the middle. All right, this is Violent Femmes by Nita Sofa Saroon, and then I'll sign off. Summer, Atlanta, 1989. Handstands in your pool. And after Marco Polo, we rest elbows on the concrete lip and ask each other what it means to lose your teeth and dreams. At night, we play Contra and pluck carrot sticks radiating from a bowl of ranch dip. Skip to 13. We chug Gatorade and gin, and you walk a straight line in the kitchen. Outside, I vomit in the daisy bed. We churn out mixtapes and collages. Wear corduroys, plaid flannel and saddle shoes. Prank call. Boys enter. I can't keep up and am mean too often. New friends rotate in. Sleepovers end. But we are loyal to some original feeling. And in April, reach out for our birthdays, up to the last time on the phone 10 years ago, when you are in LA and knitting. Trying to live in the moment. You chuckle low and quip, hope this is it. When you're gone, your dad returns some of my old letters. It's your last prank where, instead of hearing your voice, I'm forced to hear me, pretending not to need anyone, and worse, misusing curse words. You'd laugh at the desperation, almost as desperate as our first meeting on the playground swings. Strawberry blonde strands threading the chains, you toe the mulch and ask, have you even heard of the Violent Femmes? I lie and say yes. So that's Violent Femmes by Nita Sofa Saroon. I think I'm going to have to talk about Tolstoy and the Secret Show. It's such a fucking crazy book. What is art? Holy shit. Here, maybe I'll just do like a quick little sample from it, because it's like an infuriating book, but also it's one of these books where like I kept alternating between writing like hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère, and then writing like, could this even possibly be true? Like, in what world could he think this is a reasonable thing to say? So I wildly agreed and disagreed with it. Oh, he has a hilarious, brutal treatment of Wagner's Ring of the Nibelungen. Here's a sample of this crazy book that made me furious and also made me cover my face with shameful recognition of my own faults. Here's a sample to give you a sense of what it's like. The art of our time has become a harlot, and this comparison holds true in the smallest details. It is, in the same way, not limited in time, is always in fancy dress, is always for sale. It is just as alluring and pernicious. The genuine work of art can manifest itself in an artist's soul only rarely, as a fruit of all his previous life, just as a child is conceived by its mother. Counterfeit art is produced by artisans and craftsmen continually, as long as there are consumers. Whew. Yeah, fiery. So I think I'll talk about that on the Secret Show, because it is strong medicine, crazy arguments. I'll get into it there. But for now, I'm glad to be back. Thank you again to Alice. I cannot thank you enough. To hear a whole slew of episodes, including half of the ones that Alice produced and the spiel about Tolstoy whenever I am able to get it up sometime this week, go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com. Put your email address in and you'll get a week's access for free after that. It's pretty fucking cheap. So SLEERICKETS.substack.com. Sign up today. There's 130-ish episodes up on there. A lot of interesting stuff. Thank you all for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.